Hello everyone, welcome to another SAFPAC seminar. In fact, it's not just another SAFPAC seminar, we always welcome the new year with Rosie. So I'm sure everyone knows Rosie, Professor Rosie Rizq, and Rosie's Emeritus Professor of Psychoanalysis Psychotherapy at Enlightenment.
I was.
You are Emeritus Professor, aren't you?
I'm sorry, I've left, Del.
Are you not an Emeritus Professor?
Yes, I am.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. Yes, but I didn't go there anymore.
Right, okay. Well, we'll make sure that's recorded. Thank you. But most importantly, well, not almost most importantly, Rosie's book's just come out on From Fiction to Psychoanalysis. So I highly recommend it. Rosie's going to be talking this evening on the subject of transparency matters. So let's see what happens to transparency. Rosie.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. I'm a bit shattered this evening, so you'll have to forgive me if there's a bit of a red glare in my eye. I was having a wonderful grumble with Del and others, and I'm sorry, Sally, about having work done on my house. So I've just come straight from that and from chaos at home. So it's lovely to be here, and I'm hoping I'm getting a break from all the builders.
I hope it's not the kitchen or bathroom, because that's a nice stress.
This is loft and bay windows, which includes a consulting room, so it's pretty stressful. Anyway, let's get away from that, and let's go back to the spring of 1851. We're in London's Hyde Park. The Great Exhibition has just opened. It's a tremendous opportunity for Victorian Britain to display its industrial, military, and economic power. There are 14,000 exhibitors, mainly from Britain's colonies, but also from other countries around the world. They're displaying over 100,000 of the finest examples of scientific, technological, and cultural progress developed during the Industrial Revolution. The exhibits are displayed in cases that stretch for more than 11 miles, and they include pottery, porcelain, jewellery, ironwork, and steel. There are telegraphs, microscopes, surgical instruments, steam hammers, hydraulic presses, and even houses. The exhibition runs from May to October, and in those 6 months, it will attract over 6 million visitors, almost a third of the population of the UK at the time. It's destined to be the single most successful public event ever staged in the UK. The biggest attraction, though, is the array of exhibits. The extraordinary building in which they're all housed, Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace, a vast temporary structure made entirely of glass and iron. Paxton was a horticulturalist and gardener for the Duke of Devonshire, and his design for the Crystal Palace drew on new materials and methods of construction that made it possible to produce relatively cheap sheet glass. Nearly 300,000 panes of glass, covering an area of almost 1 million square feet, are used in its creation. The sight of it, says Queen Victoria in a letter, was incredibly glorious, really like fairyland. In fact, it's evident from newspaper reports that the feelings evoked by the huge opening ceremony are profound, almost religious in nature. The event, after all, is attended by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Prayers are said, and Handel's Hallelujah Chorus is sung by a choir of over 6. The most striking thing of Crystal Palace was undoubtedly the extraordinary transparency of the building. But what was concealed behind all those panes of glittering glass? Over 100 years later, Foucault will draw on Bentham's panopticon prism design to demonstrate the controlling effects of transparency, suggesting it doesn't actually expose so much as hide something. The transparent structure of the Crystal Palace evidently operated as a kind of panopticon, enabling 6 million people to inspect the commodities on display, while at the same time as affording visitors, the new consumer class, the opportunity to continually scrutinize and evaluate each other. But paradoxically, the architecture's very transparency also served to conceal the workings of an imperial power determined to advance a formidable industrial program. For despite religious fervour accompanying its opening, Crystal Palace was no glass cathedral. It was essentially a free trade exhibition, one that was there to promote the interests of British industry and commerce, to make a profit. And despite the exhibition being open to all, including for the first time the working classes who were offered a special cheap rate, the exhibition and the economy it was there to celebrate were accompanied by poverty, unemployment, and exceptionally harsh working and living conditions for much of the population. So in this paper, I want to take the Crystal Palace as our starting point for a brief critical inquiry into the preeminent status of transparency within our practice of research in the psychological therapies. It's considered foundational to scientific inquiry that the credibility of any knowledge claims accrued via what we now call evidence-based practice should rest on the transparency of the methods and measures we deploy in the research process. But as Judith Butler reminds us, the primary task of critique is not simply to evaluate whether certain practices or forms of knowledge are good or bad, but rather, as she says, to bring into relief the very framework of evaluation itself. So the purpose here is not to praise or condemn transparency, but rather to explore how its epistemology authorizes and privileges a frame of reference that may exclude other perspectives on knowing and knowledge. So I'm making a plea here for thinking carefully about transparency's moral and discursive claims to legitimacy, and for considering how these govern the way we think about ourselves and what we know in psychotherapy. Along with this, it suggests there may be forms of knowing and knowledge incompatible with the principles of transparency, and which only emerge in practices that circulate outside their jurisdiction. So let's start with transparency as a word that derives from the Latin trans, meaning across, beyond, or through, and parere, to appear, to come into sight. Transparency implies something emerging from or shining through, something coming to light. And light as preeminent symbol of visibility, reason, and progress embodies an ideal that derives directly from the Enlightenment, a time when the authority of the church, the state, and the monarchy was called into question. This paved the way to free speech, individualism, and an empirical attitude where to see was to know. Like democracy, with which it is synonymous, transparency stands for all that is open, accessible, and true, and indeed contemporary democratic governance and systems must vigorously demonstrate transparency in order to be seen as reliable, dependable, and free from corruption. Our insistence on open government, freedom of information, informed consent, and the public's right to know has today been elevated to a supreme value. Clarity and visibility are associated with responsible decision-making, predicated on established rules and procedures that are evident to all. From government ministers' expensive scandals to more recent revelations about their secret love affairs, COVID Christmas parties, dodgy deals, and dubious offshore tax arrangements, the requirement for transparency is usually considered axiomatic, natural, obvious, and beyond question. But if we're going to think critically, we might from the outset want to question what's apparently so natural or self-evident about transparency's claims. As we've seen, transparency started with the Enlightenment as a tool invented to expose and ensure the proper functioning of a representative government. It has since become a household name for us with the introduction of new public management strategies during the 1980s. An all too familiar business ontology privileging marketization, accountability, bureaucracy, and economic rationalism is now widely deployed in order to make public services and institutions more visible, efficient, and responsive to customer need. What started off then as a means of liberation from the ancien regime has over time evolved into our contemporary transparency agenda, a modern-day regime of control, legitimation, accountability, and governance, where a commitment to operating under the scrutiny of citizens and stakeholders alike is assumed. Transparency is now a global good, proffered as the solution to a range of social, economic, educational, corporate, and even environmental problems. Perhaps, though, we should hesitate before too readily committing ourselves to transparency's progressive and emancipatory ideals. My scepticism is not simply on account of transparency's unintended consequence and its obvious failure to make good those political promises to improve trust and public safety. Rather, it's because its principles of disclosure, visibility, and revelation yield knowledge claims that are privileged as neutral and objective. I'm interested in forms of disclosure that generate knowledge claims of a different order, and I want to suggest I'll suggest these emerge from modes of disclosure that rely more on secrecy and ambiguity than on openness and clarity. Indeed, transparency is often unfavorably compared to secrecy, a word that nowadays stands for all that is anti-democratic, corrupt, and taboo. Secrecy is disparaged as a tool of ideology and unaccountable power, in contrast to transparency, which is championed as an agent of change and effectiveness. But if we go back to the origin of the word secret, we learn it means to set apart or divide, to withdraw, exclude, or separate something off. So we could say the secret is something that's separated off from that which can be known. And perhaps this is why Derrida tells us that in transparency, the secret is never broached or breached. If I'm to share something, he says, to communicate, objectify, thematize, the condition is there be something non-thematizable, non-objectifiable, non-shareable. And this something, he says, is the absolute secret. What we can know then emerges out of what we cannot know. The secret that doesn't yield to excavation, to transparency. As Derrida goes on to say, secrecy does not consist in hiding something, in not revealing the truth, but rather in respecting the absolute singularity, the infinite separation of what binds me or exposes me to the unique. Derrida seems to be pointing towards secrecy as an inherent quality of otherness, an irreplaceable uniqueness that cannot be shared and perhaps never could be shared. As psychotherapists, when we operate within transparency's epistemology, we seem to believe there is a secret that can be unearthed and shared. And perhaps we hope we can track it down, trapping it under a grid of measures that will one day pluck the secret from the heart of therapy. But Derrida has something more to tell us about the nature of this. Its meaning is not available to information. Secrecy, he says, is not a thing, some information I'm hiding, or that one has to hide or dissimulate. It's rather an experience that does not make itself available to information, that resists information and knowledge, and that immediately encrypts itself. So whilst there are things that can be known, there's a quality of unknownness that is not amenable to the domain of knowledge available to transparency. The absolute secret is not something we can easily see, grasp, or comprehend. It's rather an experience which we can only with difficulty sense or apprehend. It cannot be cognitively perceived or intellectually mastered, and indeed may not be articulated with knowledge at all. And I want to return to this domain of knowing knowledge in a little while. Transparency doesn't only rely on the assumption that to see is to know. It relies on the presumption that everything must be converted into information. When we engage in evidence-based practice, as we now must if we work in the public sector, the object of our interest is usually rendered into abstract codified fragments of information that in today's digitized and commodified world can be saved, stored and collated. It even can and probably will be bought and sold. These items of data, and most of us I think are familiar with measures like PHQ-9, GAD-7 and CORE-10, are indices that can be appropriated in a way deemed to be scientific, objective, neutral and apolitical. But let's remember that information cannot speak for itself. It requires a human perspective to read, understand and think about what it means. If this is central to our clinical practice, it is also central to much of our research, and particularly newer qualitative forms of research. The narrative accounts of lived experience can only be read and interpreted in the light of specific social, cultural, political and economic contexts from which they emerge. For now, let's turn to some of the basic tools of traditional evidence-based practice and research, the protocol, the policy, and above all, the manual. These are the means by which words are transformed into information, ensuring our processes are as transparent as possible. It's accountability that's at stake here. What exactly are you doing or investigating? Can you demonstrate that the model of therapy or psychological intervention you're using or researching is the one you say it is? What constitutes a successful outcome? How do you operationalize, define it? How quickly and in how many sessions can you achieve it? There's an absolute insistence on specifying in detailed, explicit language exactly what we do as clinicians, how we do it, and with what specifiable outcomes. And to be sure, there may be very good reasons for establishing these things accurately and verifiably. But for me, there's always a particular problem with manualization. This is because it implicitly relies on a model of clinical work that treats words as information and therapy as some kind of straightforward exchange of information between therapist and patient. And this seems to presuppose a linear relationship between what is said and what is heard. In other words, there's an assumption that everybody says what they mean and others have access to that meaning in an unproblematic way. What we might call this informational model of practice presumes a predictable relationship between the words that are spoken in therapy and any clinical outcome that ensues. And I think most of us are familiar with the end result of this. It can be seen in programs such as the UK government's Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, predicated on the mass provision of evidence-based therapies as recommended by the NICE guidelines. IACT has been described by its architect David Clark as a unique exercise in public transparency. In its policies and protocols, we're presented with the familiar discourse of evidence-based practice, and we're asked to accept the idea that we should offer people, and I quote, the appropriate dose of therapy, as if one can be prescribed the right quantity of information or the right form of words, in the same way as one can be prescribed the right antibiotic or vaccine. Medical drugs, as we know only too well these days, are scientifically tested to prove they work. And so it's not surprising that we might also want to know that the words we deploy in therapy are scientifically proved to work too. The use of a drug metaphor here implies we might need to be as careful with our language as with our medicine. For words can have powerful effects, particularly, it's said, when they've been empirically tested to produce desirable outcomes, and even more when they've been professionally accredited, scientifically authorized as evidence-based work. Indeed, the transparency agenda ensures the most powerful, most effective use of words is now impounded within professional guidelines and manuals. These specify with the greatest of care how and by whom and with what credentials they may be used. But in an environment where words must be so tightly monitored, managed and manualized, I can't help wondering what it is about them that makes us all quite so anxious. Behind our obsession with the effectiveness of words in therapy, I suggest lies an ancient dilemma, one that goes back as far as Plato's doubts about rhetoric as the artificer of persuasion. On the one hand, there's our tremendous belief in the power of words to persuade, to influence, to change ourselves and the world. On the other, an equally tremendous skepticism about the ability of words to do anything at all in the face of the psychological pain and suffering we see daily in our consulting. So when, as evidence-based therapists, we ask which therapy is the most effective, perhaps we're asking, as the Greek poet George Setharis asks of poetry, whether words are really strong enough to help. The importance of finding words strong enough to help reminds us that the work we do as clinicians, researchers, is always in and through language, and it's here that the informational model of practice is most likely to get us into trouble. But we must acknowledge that the words we use in therapy are not only information, and they don't live in manuals any more than they do in dictionaries. Rather, they live in the minds and mouths of people who think and speak. They will mean different things to different people at different times. So although much evidence-based practice aims to establish and provide a form of therapy that is scientifically acknowledged to be effective, there can be no possibility of us ever establishing the best therapeutic language, one that's universally effective, one that is strong enough to help everyone, everywhere, for all time. Even if we believe the current outcome research aims more specifically at what works best for whom, the culturally alluring discourse of science with its medical and neuroscientific lexicon tells a different story. Knowledge claims that emerge from evidence couched in this powerful discourse are tilted along an empirical, evaluative axis. And this kind of language may well be scientific, and on that basis, it's often assumed to be strong enough to help most people. Its scientific credentials will certainly be reassuring to many, but not everyone will respond to it in the same way. More importantly, I think, its language disinfected of memories and association. It's the regulating, normalizing, standardizing kind of language that risks flattening and restricting the possibilities of personhood. It subordinates individuals to what Heidegger calls orderability. Part of the difficulty with the transparency agenda is that its moral and discursive legitimacy rests on the exclusion of practices whose knowledge claims resist its call to clarity. So following the critical theorist Claire Birchall, I want to interrupt the hegemony of transparency by considering the value of knowledge claims emerging from practices that do not accept transparency as the ideal model. Instead, I'm interested in practices such as poetry and psychoanalysis that adopt the rather different principles of concealment and ambiguity. So I want to return here to an interest I've previously taken in the work of the Martinican poet and cultural critic Edouard Glissant, who frames transparency in its practices of visibility as a serious problem. Glissant takes issue with colonial tendencies to reduce people to models, groups, and categories that offer a false sense of understanding in the interests of maintaining control. He's opposed to what he calls the ideal of a transparent universality imposed by Western perspective. He argues instead that modernity has naturalized and legitimated the right to transparency in a way that's always bolstered imperial control and economic domination. I think he'd have had had a lot to say about the Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace. For those commodities, under all that glittering glass, were brought over by enslaved people from countries seized by the British. Glissant suggests we resist demands to be known via the reductive economic and calculative frameworks currently colonizing society, that we safeguard our own and others' right to be known otherwise. Instead of stipulating transparency, he demands opacity, something constituted by a stubborn core of otherness or difference that's only partially available and knowable. In fact, he goes further, petitioning for the right to opacity and demanding the political right not to be reduced to universal, one-size-fits-all terms that construct the other as an object of knowledge. Glissant is primarily interested in the role of literature, especially poetry, in unsettling Western perceptions and epistemology. And I'd like to follow him in thinking of how our experience of the poem is largely dependent on its resistance to cognitive analysis and intellectual explanation. We could say its meaning is disclosed by way of opacity rather than by way of clarity. So it's not as if there's some kind of meaning or knowledge within the poem that is transparently sitting there, waiting to be exposed and articulated. What we're able to glean from a poem sits within a different register of knowledge altogether. As a very brief example, I'd like to take Elizabeth Bishop's poem, At the Fish Houses. She conceived this beautiful poem on a rare trip back to her homeland of Nova Scotia in 1948. It's a kind of allegory of our engagement with knowledge, language, and memory in the world. And it begins with a long introduction that immerses us in detailed descriptions of an old fisherman who, she says, sits netting his net in the gloaming, almost invisible. He's been scraping the silver scales from fish that have just arrived fresh off the fishing boats in the harbour. All is silver, she says, the heavy surface of the sea swelling slowly as if considering spilling over. Eventually, she turns her attention away from the concrete details of what's happening on the shore, and the poem gathers momentum until she dives lyrically into the nature of this swelling, spilling backdrop, the cold northern sea. Cold, dark, deep, and absolutely clear, element bearable to no mortal, she tells us. If you should dip your hand in, your wrist would ache immediately. Your bones would begin to ache and your hand would burn as if the water were a transmutation of fire that feeds on stones and burns with a dark grey flame. If you tasted it, she goes on to write, it would first taste bitter, then briny, then surely burn your tongue. It is like what we imagine knowledge to be, dark, salt clear, moving, utterly free. It seems to me, moving cautiously, that Bishop might be saying something about poetic, sensuous knowledge, which I think she sees forms the backdrop to all other knowledge in the world. For her, it's like the swelling sea, which is the shifting backdrop to all life in the world. And just as the heavy surface of the sea threatens to spill over, so too we encounter a surplus of meaning in our engagement with the world we know. But to know something in Bishop's register doesn't mean encountering it directly. It's rather something we can only recognise via resemblance and through an act of imagination. We're at least two removes from knowledge here. We can only know something to be like what we imagine knowledge to be. Our movement towards knowledge is dependent not on a rapid, masterful intellectual grasp, but rather on reaching out towards a more gradual, unfolding disclosure of something experienced by way of comparison, in a way that allows us to sense and imagine it otherwise. I think it's easy to be dismissive of this hesitant kind of knowledge, and we might tell ourselves that's irrelevant, literary, or even just ornamental. But maybe that's because this swelling, spilling kind of knowledge interrupts our preferred, empirically verifiable, exact, and scientific ways of seeing and knowing something. What does it mean when seeing or reading something doesn't yield to immediate illumination so much as to open onto a way of knowing something that renders it bigger, more ambiguous, more mysterious, and infinitely stranger? And perhaps as psychotherapists and researchers, we don't always allow ourselves time for this. We're hampered by the difficulty, if not the impossibility, of exempting ourselves from transparency's moral prerogative. For insofar as transparency is synonymous with democracy, the subject of democracy is today increasingly obliged to demonstrate his or her transparent credentials, to perform transparency, as it were. As psychotherapists, then, we often have to perform our practice in ways that conform to the demands of a transparent, information-driven society. And again, I'm very far from claiming this is redundant. Transparency obviously has significant justifications, particularly in society. We do need to know that democratically elected representatives can be held accountable. And perhaps it follows in a much smaller way that our psychotherapy practice, its methods, measures and processes do in some way need to be made visible and available to others. Yet if, as the transparency agenda claims, to see is to know, then is it too easy and too tempting to assume that human beings can be seen and can therefore be known, that we can and do have access to ourselves, and we can therefore account for ourselves and for those whose thoughts, feelings and behaviour we're exploring? I do think there's a tremendous claim being made here. The claim to be a sovereign, autonomous self who produces, possesses and displays herself, a self who can know and be known by others. And I think this is the fantasy of transparency that I'm really trying to interrogate. By privileging the total visibility of information, we could say the transparency agenda mandates the total visibility of the self. At this point, I'd like to push the envelope of our inquiry a little bit further.
Rosie, can I just interrupt you?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a way I think the boxing next door is interfering with people
Is it?
hearing you. I do apologise to people there.
If you want me to come forward,
Could you come closer at all? And again, my apologies to people who are trying to listen.
Shall I come up here?
Something like that.
I don't know if they can see me now,
They can't
but
see
maybe
you,
that
or-
doesn't matter.
You can just tilt the camera a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay. Can people see me? No, they can't. So apologies for you if you haven't been able to hear much of what's gone on so far, but I'll carry on. At this point, I was saying, I want to push the envelope of our inquiry a bit further and shift from poetry to psychoanalysis. For psychoanalysis, like poetry, is a practice whose knowledge claims are dependent on a certain lack of transparency. And indeed, in psychoanalysis, the therapist deliberately cultivates a stance of neutrality that's crucial to the development of that creative illusion we call transference. When unconscious feelings derived from early childhood relationships are located and enacted within the therapeutic relationship, the therapist will certainly come to know something about his or her patient. But the knowledge won't arrive ready-made in the form of data or information. It won't necessarily announce itself in empirical terms, and indeed it may not even be thought of or articulated as knowledge at all. This is the kind of knowledge that's more likely to become available as a counter-transferential feeling or embodied sensation. For this reason, the psychoanalyst Christopher Bolus calls this kind of knowledge the unthought known. And even though psychoanalysis is predicated on a wish for self-knowledge and relies on the patient's cooperation in exploring difficult feelings and thoughts, there are always limits to what we can know of ourselves. And this isn't just because of some romantic, ineffable core within the self. Psychoanalytic theory reminds us that our subjectivity is given over to the other from the start as a condition of our primary relationality. From our earliest moments, Laplanche suggests, we're shaped and influenced by our relationship to the other, whose enigmatic unconscious messages permeate and saturate us. The untranslatable residue of these messages forms the basis of our own unconscious drives, so we are truly constituted from the outset by the other. We're also inflected by invisible cultural norms, power hierarchies, and normative discourses that we're born into and to which we wittingly or unwittingly subscribe. We're always already inscribed by a radically unknowable alterity, propelling our psychic life, our subjectivity, and our speech, an alterity that renders us forever foreign to ourselves and that cannot, as Judith Butler said, be tied to the conceit of a self fully transparent to itself. And perhaps we've reached here a central part of the very evaluative framework of transparency, the iron structure, as it were, supporting all those fragile panes of glass, the so-called knowing and knowable subject. But if critical thinking involves questioning our taken-for-granted frameworks, then perhaps we've begun to see how assumptions of knowability structure the very way we think about our practice and research, the very way we understand and make sense of the people and the experiences we're investigating. We might need to acknowledge there can be other kinds of knowing and knowledge that circulate outside the dominating epistemology of transparency. And as I hope the practices of poetry and psychoanalysis show, knowledge can come about by means of something other than the disclosures mandated by transparency's call to clarity. Both poetry and psychoanalysis suggest that a lack of transparency can be productive rather than repressive, creative rather than constricting, integral rather than marginal. Along the way, we might remember that Glissant's clamour for the right to opacity is framed within what he calls a poetics of relation. And to approach knowledge poetically, I think, means to approach it by way of indirection, perhaps as something that's like knowledge, that can only be known experientially via imaginative act, rather than cognitively via intellectual force. Again, I want to avoid here any idea that Glissant's right to opacity means resorting to romantic notions of the inscrutable, the unreadable, or the ineffable. Instead, I take it to mean acknowledging the sheer intractability of what and who we work with. It means engaging with an order of knowledge that's not reducible to information, nor to established normative meanings. So perhaps, as psychotherapists, we might consider adopting a poetics of relation as a critical practice, a mode of attention or an ethic that offers a powerful counterweight to, correction of, and barrier against the homogenizing discourses of well-being and evidence-based practice that so easily claim us and our psychological subjects as knowing and knowable. As I've tried to show, I think there are forms of disclosure that can offer a kind of knowing that's more intricate and more complex than the kind dreamed of by transparency's standardizing philosophy. A poetics of relation will ensure we read texts and people with particular care and attention, that we address rather than avoid ambiguity and difference. It insists we acknowledge and embrace the limits of what can be seen and known, and it helps us resist the easy assumptions of knowability within our settled epistemologies, our traditional frameworks, and our foundational certainties. And just as there are no universally established meanings in language, We might remember there's no universally agreed definition of transparency outside the discursive formations or political contexts that invoke it, which to say that what we come to know via our practice is not like the weather. It's not a natural given, but rather historical, contingent, contextual, and contestable. It's transient, endlessly in flux, subject to linguistic constructions as well as to change and decay. Elizabeth Bishop puts this a great deal better than me. At the end of the poem, she suggests we imagine knowledge to be drawn from the cold, hard mouth of the world, derived from the rocky breasts forever, flowing and drawn. And since our knowledge is historical, flowing and flown. I'm almost finished now. I hope you'll not think that I'm making some simplistic suggestion that reading poetry will necessarily make us better practitioners. I guess it might. But if it seems strangely radical to consider a poetics of relation in the context of discussing psychotherapy practice, perhaps this is because it's become hazardous in our neoliberal times, most particularly in our public services, institutions and universities, to critique the prevailing business ontology that shackles so much of our thinking and being. If it seems risky to speak of modes of disclosure that do not rely on transparency, perhaps this is because the implicit kind of knowing that emerges from the work of careful reading, listening and interpretation is, along with the humanities themselves, somehow considered less valuable than the explicit kind of knowing assumed to emerge from the STEM subjects. That's science, technology, engineering and maths. But cultivating a poetics of relation as psychotherapists might stimulate a potential within us that speaks not to power, profit and achievement, nor to the rapid promulgation of marketable forms of knowing and knowledge. Rather, I think it will nourish and sustain a practice of slow, critical thinking and reading, something too often deemed surplus to the requirements of our entrepreneurial businesses and public services. A poetics of relation might allow us to question rather than foreclose the terms and conditions of our psychotherapy practice, to imagine our research otherwise, and to think again about whether and how and if transparency matters. I think I'll leave it there. I don't want to compete with this lot. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. So let's open it up, please. Some questions, thoughts.
Yeah, Rosie, I really enjoyed your talk. Are you a psychoanalytic therapist? Okay. What I'm quite interested in language is as well, which I think you're sort of alluding to actually. Funnily enough, I suppose maybe this is what I'm picking up on. That is, I wonder if you could have done that whole. I probably wouldn't want to go through that 45 minutes again and try and convey sort of sadness in it or anger in us. You know, when it incites something, but it's like the feelings that words can carry as well. So I can say hello to someone in this room. I could go around to say hello to everyone, but I could say it different each time to someone. Probably make you all feel something different every time I said it. You know, that idea that language, I suppose there's a whole subtext of feeling as well that it can carry. I don't know what you think about that.
I think that's what Elizabeth Bishop is getting at, isn't she?
Yeah, I think so.
You know, I mean, this colossal sensuousness in her poetry, I think, is filled with feeling. It's a bit like the swelling sea, you know, that the language is filled with something that overflows the bounds of the actual word that you might use, because there's a whole, as you say, sort of subtext that goes on. And it's different for everybody. I think that's what's so important. And I suppose that's the bit that I'm trying to get at in writing. The ways that language is developed now in terms of psychotherapy practice and research, it's so limited. And the more we specify it, the more limited it is. As I say, it's sort of disinfected of anything personal.
But there's even a disinfection of something personal. You know, I'm training now. I'm looking at various textbooks of people, practitioners, showing like case studies, for example, and then trying to get a sense of how that might have sounded in the room, between the client and the therapist. There's a sense to which you can't quite get out of that, and it's left to your own interpretation, really.
Rosie, could I ask you if you could sit here?
Sorry, yes.
Thank you for the people on the screen. Thank you, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Just a minute.
Can you hear me?
Only just.
Okay.
Now we can.
That's better.
Can you hear me okay? Shall
Yeah,
I
that's
start?
better.
Okay. Well, okay. Thank you for a wonderful talk. It's been too long since I had an inspiring talk like this. The poetry section was overpowered by the boxing, and I know that Nabokov wrote about boxing as a poetic act, but it's hard. It's hard. Okay, one thing, I think you made the point already, Rosie. I just wanted to emphasize this. It seems the element of control is crucial to this notion of transparency. And Derrida himself would say, what would you call a society where there is absolute transparency? You would call it authoritarian, and this was long before CCTV and all that. I also wonder, I have sort of parallel thoughts. I wonder whether the evidence-based mantra is a bad version of science, whether it's an oversimplified caricature of science itself, and whether there might be something else in even in positivism. And I'm thinking, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was fascinated recently by Freud's early writing, Discarded, Project for a Scientific Psychology. Somewhere there's some arresting passages in there where he says, affects do not reflect, affects do not think, affects act. And there is a new contemporary thought called new materialisms, which is emphasizing this aspect. Could it be that the evidence-based scenario is doing a disservice to science itself? There is a lot more. I'm very, very excited by this notion that poetics of relation could be applied in therapy. And this notion of poetics is also very, very, very stimulating, very fertile. I'm reminded of Hölderlin, dwelling poetically on earth. Dwelling poetically on earth would mean not claiming ownership of this place, the therapy room included. We are passing through, and so we are both analyst and patient are guests. I wonder whether poetry also plays in that sense. And sadly, I couldn't hear the bit on poetry. I wonder whether the paper could be made available as a writing thing, because some of it was incomprehensible, sadly. My final point was, I don't know whether what your call for a poetics of relation is any longer possible within a qualitative form of research. I see the qualitative research has become completely formulaic, and whether a new goalpost is needed, post-qualitative research. And the inspiration there for me is Benjamin, who would say, don't worry about apprehending, holding this knowledge. Epistemology might be based on fear. What we need to do is to allow the material to build and form itself. And there's a lot more, but it's yeah, thank you for, I certainly find it very inspiring.
Oh, thank you, Manu, and thank you for some very, very rich thoughts there too. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on those. A lot of things coming up.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering, Rosie, that's about the whole, what you said about transparency. I wonder if you could do something similar with the notion of research. Yeah? You know, because it's somehow, you know, it's a bit like saying something, being a member of the royal family and saying something about against the Queen. You know, it's just not allowed. You know, it's but the idea of thoughtful practice, for example. Right?
And thoughtful research.
Yeah, but the problem with research has got so debased because the quantitative research, which I in some ways think is better than the qualitative research, but when you look at at randomized control trials, for example, they're absolute total rubbish when they come to psychological therapies. It just it's, you know, you shouldn't get an O-level pass if you think it's of any use, you know, to the multivariable nature. And if you look at randomized control trials that have been done, they are total rubbish from a scientific point of view. Yeah. Similarly, I think I agree with Manu that the hope that I had once of qualitative research, it's again just inappropriate.
Well, I think that's partly because these different forms of research get sort of greedily captured by the notion of transparency. And it's got to be evident to all. We have to follow these particular ways of doing things. And any hope, and I think this is what Manu is saying, that evidence-based practice has become a sort of debased version even of the science, which you may or may not like. But certainly randomized controlled trials are being inappropriately applied to psychotherapy. But the whole notion of transparency, I mean, yeah, we've just been through the COVID situation, haven't we? And we would like some transparency about the way vaccines are developed. We've had some transparency about it. But, I mean, transparency does have a place. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. It does have a place. But whether it has a place in psychotherapy, practice and research is really what I'm interested in.
Perhaps transparency is a symptom of something else. And well, I think somehow the core of the problem is the notion of identity. Transparency is one of the is part of the identity toolbox. You know, and identity goes back to how we reason, you know, and how we don't want to have paradoxes in our reasoning. So we say, you know, A has to be equal to A. So that's how you set up transparency. Transparency always implies a gap, a distance, you know. And then you can ask whether it's transparent or opaque. But the assumption is that there is a gap between me and the other person. And that's because we fetishize this notion of identity. That I'm separate from you, therefore there can be a question whether the relationship between us is transparent or opaque. But the assumption is that first of all that we are separate. So we need to tackle this notion. Perhaps there is no, perhaps we are mistaken in taking identity as a given.
What would that look like?
Difference.
I'm not sure what other people think about that identity is the issue.
I'm completely balmy here, but I'll go with it. From the beginning of your talk, the thing that came up in my mind was something about truth and torture. Torture. Why do we torture people? Some of it is control, some of it is trying to extract the truth. It's in an acute scenario. Invariably, we try and we believe that there's some hidden truth that we've got to extract from somebody, and the only way to do it is to torture them. And invariably, because the person is so tortured, they end up making a story. And they're dispensable after that. They're probably dispensable even before.
Well, not totally dispensable, because you've got to get the truth out of them.
Yeah. And I wonder how much of that actually you can literally take and see correspondences in what goes on with the transparencies.
I was thinking the idea of truth. There's an idea that there is a truth rather than several individual truths. And the idea that you can get to that truth and have some knowledge. I think there's an underlying anxiety about that. I think, well, I have anyway. There's an idea that if you can just control things, there's a huge anxiety. If you can only control things and know things, then you can stop something bad happening. If you make everything okay, or it's an illusion that we can pin things down. And the more things, you things that go out of control, the more that sort of sense of power comes in. You've got to know, you've got to be anything, you've got to know what to do. And so there's a whole sense of urgency in which individuals become anxious that they're not doing the right thing. So the more anxious you get, the less able we are to think and to dream and imagine. And what struck me when you were talking was just the idea permanently to me was the links of permanency. We can't just let the joy catch the joy as it flies. We have to pin something down. We have to know, and that kills it. That kills the knowledge, the immediacy and the imagination that is so much part of the soul of psychotherapy. So that's what I was. Something just came to me that.
Something that beyond saying the answer kills the question.
Yes.
I have Gadama and truth from that as well.
I was thinking, wonderful talk, by the way, Rosie, really wonderful. Always love listening. I was thinking of Wittgenstein, and, if a lion could speak, we wouldn't understand what it's trying to say. And what I was picking up from the talk was an idea of, services being used almost like a translation. What do I mean with these words? Can you translate what's happening to me? As opposed to a poetics, I think more in the sense of a playfulness with words, that words aren't static, that they're not objects, that they're not concrete, and that they can be played with in the room, and they can be played with, in lots of different formats. But yeah, I definitely started to pick up the sense of, we're a translating service now. I'll say these words and you translate what that means and the implications that has for me. And I think that's the danger of what we do with the words, that we think we know.
It's come to be the danger of what we do, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I think that's what sort of fascinates me about the idea about manualization. That something, I'm going back to Di's point, something is pinned down and specified.
Yes. Yeah.
This is what it's about. This is roughly what you say. This is what you do, as opposed to, I suppose I'm trying to get away from the sort of binary. And I've realized that in my old age, I do actually think of therapy as far more of an art than a science. And I know that's a very tenuous binary, but the idea of pinning something down into scientific form just seems abhorrent to me.
I was thinking about the idea of torture, and the idea that it gets something out of something. But I don't think, I think maybe it's not. Maybe the idea of torture isn't really to get to the truth. It's just to torture. You know, that actually what you want to do is torture someone.
Which is why you get the fiction of the...
Sure. But is there something the same about manualisation? That people produce manuals not to get to transparency, but just so that you've got a manual. And it's some sort of violence or control. You know, that it's not, you know, it's whose transparency is it? You know, that transparency means something different. It may be neutral, but it depends who's using it and for what purpose.
Well, it maybe it's a little bit like the transparency that goes on in government.
Well,
which, you know, we're
precisely.
supposed to know what goes on, but look at what goes on.
Well, transparency is used to conceal.
Yes, it is.
The idea of, you know, we only have to look at the news each evening and see, you know.
Do you mean transparency over something whilst not talking about the other thing?
Or that's one way of using transparency to conceal. Yeah.
There is something inherently masculine in transparency.
Now, how do you come to that?
Well, because it seems to me that there is a separation between, let's say, the father and the child. You know, the child appears somehow into the world. The father has no relationship, it's separate. You know, so I think from that maybe a sense of transparency of things just being, you know, without any relation to you. Maybe it comes from that. I'm thinking about, you know, Lucy Garay talking about Poetics of sexual difference. You know, and how the kind of the female grasp of the world has more room for messiness, for being sort of enmeshed, you know, with your hands in the slimy, in the rummy, you know. And for the men, it's all quite style-out. And that sterility seems to me, or the transparency might be longing for something very clean.
Sorry, you were going to say.
So, well, I guess the thing that kind of stood out to me, so it's kind of part of what Daniel was saying, but in the discussion about IAPT and transparency, there was the thing that really stood out was this idea of performing transparency as the okay, we don't know how, the government or people who are behind IAPT are probably thinking, we've got this amount of budget, people have mental health problems, how do we solve that with the budget? And they're just looking for any sense of false legitimacy, what ends up being false legitimacy, to justify that they're doing something. And in that research, there was also something I remember reading a paper discussing economics in its attempt to be scientific, or to see itself as a science. Then they come up with all these formulas and quantitative measures, but what is valuable is therefore only what's measurable, and everything which can't be measured and is valuable doesn't find its way in. And it seems like the attempt to make psychotherapy or psychological therapies a science on par with economics. I mean, economics is already flawed, and there's some maneuverability there, and psychology, which is the heart of subjectivity, is surely an impossible enterprise. Yeah, there's just something there, like even with when you do measure the differences or what's effective, you're probably thinking that it ends up being CBT and its structured approach or whatever, when actually it's just the relationship, for example, that they found to be more important when it comes to the therapies. But I'm probably rambling now.
Can I try and sort of say something which I think is related to what you were saying and what you were saying as well? You know, I really enjoyed your talk, of course. You know, the project was great, and there were lots of things. I was trying to think a bit about. I think one of the things that's going to sort of stay with me is that you seem to be saying something like that there is let's say a mistake about what speaking is about. You know, the idea that speaking is about giving information, so I think that, you know, speaking and concealing and all that. We don't only speak to tell people things. We speak in order to not to tell people things, not to betray things. And I thought that what she said was her name Elizabeth Bishop about her version of knowledge, the swelling and spilling kind of knowledge, which made me think of what Daniel was, you know, talking about it being it could be gendered in a way. And I guess I think that sort of, to me, makes more sense of what it might be like moment to moment, like now, and with clients, in that there's a sense of, I suppose, at the moment being pregnant with all sorts of possibilities. And the question is always about which possibility you take up. Yeah. Of course, speaking is like that, isn't it? That there's so many sort of things you can make of the speaking. And I think the speaking goes, it's a bit like a boat on the rough sea in all the sort of things that are going on. That's why, you know,
but there's also an excess, isn't there? I think
yes,
that's
no,
what Bishop is talking about.
No, absolutely.
We barely can hold this signification.
Absolutely. That's why I'm trying to say something about, it's like being in a little boat on the rough sea. And there's all sorts of things that sort of, you know, we've been thrown here and there. And it's like you can take a very simple-minded notion of speaking, but it just sort of, it's, you know, you say things that correspond to the truth or whatever it is, and you give information. But I'm saying it's much messier than that, just like you're saying. And it reminds me of, there's a quote from Stanley Cavell, which says something like, the language we make use of is known by everyone who speaks the language, and by no one, including us, I think, is the idea. And I think there's something that is much closer to the idea of speaking that you're talking about. Anyway, that's really great.
There's a wonderful essay by Virginia Woolf on words and the sort of language that we use in everyday life, and the sort of network of associations that we have to. And she plays with it most beautifully, and I can't begin to describe it now, but she's someone who really knows something about words and what we do with words, what they mean, and what they could mean, and what they don't mean, and how we play them. So she's a wonderful writer.
I'll have a look. I don't know it, but there's the essay "Truth and Lie," Nietzsche's essay, which is about language and how we sort of perhaps a bit too crude about language, you know, and which I think is along the lines of what you're talking about.
I think I'm becoming increasingly interested in not necessarily what the therapists or even the philosophers have to say about our work, but what do the writers, the novelists, the poets, the playwrights, what do they have to say about our work? What do they know that we could learn from? And it just seems to me that crossover is very little discussed. Very little discussed.
I guess, go on.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say about, sorry, I don't know if I missed bits because you can only hear certain amounts, but I wonder about the impact of something like results and outcome on speech, and what it's like to not have results and outcomes on speech, but to just have speech for the pleasure of speech or for something else. And I wonder about when you start to establish an outcome from something, how it changes what goes on with the speech, how that interacts with it.
I don't know what people might think about. I mean, many of you who are working, if you're working in the public sector, you're presumably dealing with outcomes in your work, no?
There's something akin to the medical model, isn't there? I mean, the medical model looks at the person. It looks at the symptoms and the issues that are within that person. It doesn't address the person himself. I think the corresponding thing in therapy is we end up talking about people rather than to them.
But let's not forget, IACT is predicated from the outset on giving people a label. People are diagnosed, often by very inexperienced people, on the basis of a few lists of symptoms. And then they're treated accordingly. So I think this whole notion of evidence is predicated on something that not all of us would agree is the right thing to do, or even make sense. It's based on putting people into a category immediately.
I think it does a real damage to the people who are in IAP, because I actually did an IAP training a while ago, and all these people are enthusiastic to help people, and then you start learning these tools, and you're encouraged to think of, you're doing the right thing for someone, and you start learning the language of what we know about anxiety is, and really kind of manipulating people, really thinking you're doing the right thing. And I kind of felt like on that training, you learn how to come across as transparent and clear in what you're doing, but actually you're sticking to a manual. You do have your own agenda that you're not necessarily sharing. So I think there's a lot of people who train in IAPT who want to do something good, and actually they kind of become a part of the system as well, kind of unwittingly.
I fear that's true of psychology, psychiatry, and now increasingly psychotherapy.
My partner is training to be an educational psychologist, and she's midway through, over halfway middle, and she's quite impressed with it actually. I've said there's a spare seat on the course if she wants to join, because I think what you're saying is like poetry to my ears. I wouldn't be able to go around saying this to people. I feel like I could say this here without sounding pretentious, but I do feel like I can be a bit of a poet that I am in the room with a client. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on it. Because when you're with people who maybe aren't used to, who haven't got a very rich vocabulary, or who aren't very used to the idea of playing around with languages and means of expressing themselves, because I've worked with people who maybe because of their education or upbringing, or just because they're just, let's say that someone's not really had a platform for being heard very much in their lives, so just allow, like I'm doing now, allowing myself, I hadn't really planned out what I was going to say, but just keep working with people that are like that. I've always been interested in to what degree, because being mindful of what words can mean to other people, once they're out there in the room with a client, they're kind of not your own anymore. So and I like to try and invite people to play around with their thoughts and feelings through words I might bring, but then I'm always in hindsight thinking, did I do a bit much there? Did I say to them, what damage may I have done? Did I instill some idea in their minds which is not going to go away now? Sometimes can be permanent to language, even though we're talking about transparency here. People can take something away.
Yes, and we don't know what that is. That's the wonderful thing.
Also the scary thing, I think, as well.
They might have taken something away had you not spoken.
Precisely, yeah.
It's the abstract nature of language or lack of, it's the play the note or not the note not to play.
Yes. Either way, you were there.
You're doing something to them by being there in the room with them. The language, the abstraction of the relationship with someone.
I just think it's good. Maybe it could sound kind of a warning about poetry. Mao Zedong was writing poems. Stalin was writing poems. So I think, I don't know. Do we really want therapists to become poets, especially bad ones?
The thing is, Daniel, though, is that if you were in a totalitarian state, then the first thing to go is the writers, the poets, the imagination. And so, although it's dangerous, yes. But do we really want therapists to suddenly become, bad poets? But I think we still play the metaphor without, it's a delicate touch and impose metaphors.
I think one of the problems with evidence-based practice and the lexicon of evidence-based practice is it does what George Orwell said. It's fewer and fewer words. Every year, fewer and fewer words. That's what we have to watch out for. And I think, coming back to your lovely point about poetry, maybe that's what we're in the business of, is we're in the business of producing more words, more and more and more words, like the swelling sea, you know, that threatens to spill over. I think we need more words, more sentences, more descriptions, more possibilities, rather than fewer.
I think you're talking about something about recognising something about language, isn't it? Isn't it? As opposed to the sort of, yeah.
I hadn't really thought of it like that.
I was thinking of a therapy session I had many years ago with a woman who, it was in the National Health Service in a GP practice, and this woman came. She had 6 sessions, and she spent the first 2 just sitting crying. She didn't say anything. And in the 3rd session, she sat crying, and right towards the end, she just said, "Mum." And that was so, she didn't need to sort of say anymore. It was just this, it was so much was infused into it. So there's something so personal, so unique in the moment, in every word, in every, that she didn't really need to say very much. I think that was just, she was able to say something. She got that word. And that was so important. So I'm sure that, I actually thought very much of that, that we, but also I wonder what becomes of dreams in the world of transparency. It's not
They're an embarrassment, surely.
Well, I think that, I mean that in many ways, an analysis and where it grew, the idea of dreams was key. And it just, but the point of dreams is they're not transparent. They can't be transparent.
Maybe there's not a point to dreams. I mean, that is the point. There's not a point.
Well, exactly. That there's something, there is maybe a point, but it's not the point that I have to find necessarily.
I have to say, I've not heard of dreams being any part of IAPT. I don't know whether anybody has.
No, that IAPT wouldn't know what to do.
More like,
Yeah.
The extreme of what you're saying, Sally, is computers can't dream.
Okay, what was that Philip K. Dick book?
Rosie, I'm just wondering, I will not agree with this, but I'm aware of difficulty people have had listening, and I've squirmed every time that somebody's mentioned torture, because I think that's what they were going through sometimes when they're listening to the poem. Is there a possibility that you could read some of those poems again, just to end with?
The bit that I
Listen?
did?
Yeah, for example.
Or the Elizabeth Bishop?
Whatever, yeah, I think it would be lovely.
Sally, something in what you were saying reminded me of just performance art, and that is something that's just listing out. These are things I find valuable versus doing a performance art piece and then saying at the end, the richness that you get from the former the advantage of form. Maybe psychotherapy is then about opening up richness or soulfulness or these things as opposed to truth.
Might be
So Dell's asked me to say a little bit, to re-quote some of the poem that some of you may have missed, and particularly Manu, I'm afraid, missed it. This is Elizabeth Bishop's poem To the Fish Houses, which was written in 1948. And I said that it's a kind of allegory of our engagement with knowledge, language, and memory in the world. And it begins with this really beautiful, long introduction about this old fisherman, she says, who sits netting his net in the gloaming, almost invisible. And he's been scraping the silver scales from fish that have just arrived in the harbour. And Elizabeth Bishop says, all is silver, the heavy surface of the sea, swelling slowly as if considering spilling over. And I think, though I haven't put it here, that the poem goes on to say the sea is opaque, which is interesting in the nature of our discussion later on. And then she says the sea is cold, dark, deep, and absolutely clear. element bearable to no mortal. If you should dip your hand in, your wrist would ache immediately. Your bones would begin to ache, and your hand would burn as if the water were a transmutation of fire that feeds on stones and burns with a dark grey flame. If you tasted it, it would first taste bitter, then briny, then surely burn your tongue. It is like what we imagine knowledge to be, dark, salt, clear, moving, utterly free. So I don't think that would go down particularly well, would it?
Thank you.
Well, does this seem like a moment?
To the Fish Houses is the name of the poem.
Can I sort of just do something which I don't know if it's going to work at all, but I think that one of the things that's really interesting in what you're saying is something about how we might turn our attention to the light that makes it possible for us to see. You know, so that as opposed to, you know, it's to the sort of paradigm. So I think you quoted Judith Butler. And I'm sure I'm not going to get away with this because it doesn't work. I'm trying to think a bit about light and phenomenology and the idea that what appears to the light. And I was trying to sort of think about its relevance to us and what we think we're up to. That's what I haven't got very far. I'm trying to do that.
Isn't there some rabbinic tradition about the dark and light? If you want to see the light, you can see the light from the dark. You can't see the dark from the light.
And you can't see the light from the light.
You can't see the dark from the light. You can't see into the darkness from the place of light.
So you can only see the dark from the light. No,
Sorry?
you can only see the light from the dark.
Yeah, you'd have to be in the dark to see the light, but if you're in the light, you can't see the dark.
I think you can do both. I think most people probably almost start from a place of lightness. They have a very rigid, knowledgeable conception of who they are, and maybe they don't like who they are. But it takes that in the first place to move into the unknown, uncertainty. And maybe once you step into that unknownness, you can. Doesn't mean that something necessarily then goes out in terms of light. I think to constantly sort of, dancing around each other in a way. I think it's. I think the two almost depend on each other in order for there to be any kind of self-dialogue.
Yeah, you've got to be in the
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
The poem was beautiful, by the way. I hadn't heard it the first time round. That's a beautiful poem. The poem's so full of temptation, isn't it? I think that's kind of what Will's saying, that it feels seductive. You want to get in the water, but you know it's too dangerous. But you want to
read the whole thing, Patricia. It's a very, very, very beautiful poem.
Very seductive, really seductive. Yeah, incredible. Thank you.
Well, what's the title of the poem? What's the title?
It's called To the Fish Houses.
To the Fish Houses. Thank you very much.
I'll give Del a copy of the talk to you.
So
you'll have it. Yeah.
Wonderful talk. Really fantastic talk. Marvelous speech. Really great stuff.
Thank you.
Okay. I think you said it all. Thank you very much, Julie. So thank you very much, Rosie, for your annual pilgrimage to enable us to let the light in. Thank you. Thank you.
you guys have just taken me away from the horror that's waiting for me back home. So thank you. Thank you very much.
At least